A few words about our speaker. Dr. Robert Russell is the Ian Barber Professor of Theology and Science in Resident at the Graduate Theological Union and is the founder and director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. Holds a PhD in physics and advanced degrees in theology. His organization is worldwide leader in the study of the interface between modern science and religion. The CTNS faculty offers courses at the doctorate and seminary levels in order to bring future clergy and faculty to a great awareness of this important interdisciplinary area. And it is indeed my honor to introduce my friend and our speaker for this weekend, Bob Russell.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you, friends, so much for inviting me here to give the Henrietta Purdue Memorial Lectures this month, and for you to share this time together, both this evening, and I hope you'll be coming back tomorrow morning for 3 hours of nonstop conversation and exploration of issues in faith and science. So we're going to go for about an hour and a half, and after maybe half that time, 45 minutes, 50 minutes of presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. I think we need the lights back up again. Okay. So 5 issues on the frontier of theology and science. This will be an overview conversation in case you can't come back tomorrow. And if you do come back, it'll prime the pump for focusing on 2 or 3 of them in much more detail. Let me first suggest that there are at least 4 ways people enter into this conversation. They bring this as a presupposition to the conversation, and that is that science and religion are either in conflict, or they are totally independent, or they are engaged in a creative dialogue, or perhaps even a strong form of exchange and interaction. And you'll be seeing these voices having their time, having their say, as we explore the 5 topics today. So watch for voices of conflict, others saying, keep them separate, others, like all of us, I would believe, saying, let's see if we can't learn from each other through mutual respect and the integrity of our sense of engagement through dialogue and interaction. So today it's really going to be a focus on the integration-interaction model. 5 issues. 1, from Big Bang cosmology, does a beginning of the universe at the beginning of time, t equals 0, support belief in God? 2, does the fine-tuning of the universe support belief in God or not? 3, Neo-Darwinian evolution. Is a theistic interpretation, that is, theistic evolution, the best response, or are there other ones such as conflict or atheism, which we need to take into consideration? 4, in light of Neo-Darwinian evolution, what is God's response to suffering in nature? God acts through natural processes, as many Christians claim, and I claim God does. What about suffering and waste and death in nature? And then 5, the hardest one, those of us who believe in the bodily resurrection are faced with this challenge. What do we say about the scientific predictions for the far future, which doesn't look like Jerusalem descending or the kingdom coming? So what do we say about that? So 5 issues of the really dozens of crucial issues that could be looked at. And I'd be delighted to have us conversation extend to some of the other ones as we go forward tonight and tomorrow. So, Big Bang discovered. Big Bang cosmology is based on Einstein's fundamental insight, which I've written down in a series of, in one equation, just to have you see it. And this equation is really a monumental shift in our conception of nature, because it says space and time are not like a container, as they were for Aristotle and Plato, and as they were for Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and Newton, Galileo. Space and time are actually respond to the distribution of matter and energy in the universe. It isn't just like a coffee cup that you pour liquid into. It's actually a very flexible environment which responds to matter and energy. And Einstein represented that with this beautiful equation that the curvature of space-time is affected by the distribution of matter. and the distribution of matter changes the curvature of space-time. A radical new concept of nature. We've probably all seen images like this of the elastic band or elastic surface with the heavy egg, right, distorting the surface and bending it, and then planets moving in geodesics, shortest distances, shortest paths on the surface. So matter tells space how to curve. Space tells matter how to move. Now, in this standard model, the very early models, think back to the 1950s through the 1960s, there were really three possible solutions to Einstein's equations: the so-called open saddle, the open three-flat, and the closed three-sphere. Closed three-sphere is easiest to imagine. Think of a sphere blowing up and then deflating again, so it blows up and deflates. In these other two models, the universe expands forever. This is size, this is time. Expands forever. Now, all three of these models carry this absolutely stunning feature, that there is a beginning of time, t equals 0. All three of these models carry this feature because of very profound equations and theorems by Hawking and Penrose and others. John Wheeler called this the greatest paradox in the books of physics. How could the universe as a whole begin? Even for Aristotle, the universe was eternal, finite in size, but eternal. For Newton, it was infinite in size, eternal. For Einstein, it begins. So, three types of responses to the question, is the beginning of time, the beginning of the universe, relevant to Christian theology? Now, some will say yes, it's directly relevant. It's really a big deal. Right. In fact, for Pope Pius XII in 1951, Big Bang cosmology was seen to support faith in God the Creator, which is a fairly straightforward move. And Hugh Ross, who's the head of an organization called Reasons to Believe, continues to argue that Big Bang cosmology is actually a sufficient evidence for God in itself. You don't need faith independently of reason. The Big Bang cosmology is a basis for faith. Interestingly, Fred Hoyle, the renowned atheist, also said t equals 0 is very, very relevant. But being an atheist, he wanted to get rid of it. Pope Pius XII rejoiced in t equals 0. Fred Hoyle, being an atheist, said this is a big deal. We need to get rid of it. And tomorrow, we'll spend a few minutes looking at his actual strategy for overcoming the problem of t equals 0. Okay, so I invite you to remember this piece, this point here. We're going to move on tonight because we're doing a kind of waterfront tour. But tomorrow we'll come back and say, what did Fred Hoyle do to get rid of t equals 0? And was it a legitimate move? And we'll think about it together. Okay. Now, the other side of the equation is to say, this issue of t equals 0 is entirely irrelevant to faith. It simply doesn't matter. Who cares what happened 13.7 billion years ago? I care, about my job, my family, or about the death of my parents. I don't really care about the beginning of the universe. Now, a lot of us might think that. What's interesting is that three of the leading scholars, three of my leading colleagues in science and religion, think that too. John Polkinghorne, Arthur Peacock, and Bill Carroll will all three say t equals 0 is simply not relevant theologically. So that's the opposite point of view from Pope Pius XII and Fred Hoyle, who said it's absolutely top-notch of importance. Okay. Now, most of us are in the middle camp. Remember, Aristotle's ethics was the golden mean between two extremes, right? So most of us are in the indirectly relevant theology camp. We'll say science provides confirmation for theology, but not proof. Science and theology are consonant. This is a theology of nature, theology reflecting on nature. So Ian Barber, for whom I'm honored to carry the chair, to hold the chair in his name, Erna McMullen, distinguished Catholic, Roman Catholic philosopher of science, Ted Peters, my colleague, Lutheran at the Lutheran Seminary, Francis Collins, head of the NIH, conservative Christian, evangelical, and outspoken on the importance but not the proof that T equals 0 offers to Christian faith. So this is a wide spread of people. Here's one way of envisioning its importance, its indirect importance. Contingency is a category in philosophy. It says things needn't be at all. Things need not be. Why is there anything at all is a profound mystery. Things needn't be the way they are. They could be different. Right? The universe is not necessary. It's a brute fact. And in the context of cosmology, T equals 0 would represent a form of contingency. Anything has a beginning, needn't have been. In the context of theology, contingency reflects the belief that Christians and Jews and Muslims share, which is that God is the creator out of nothing. Right? And nothing isn't something. It's not anything. God is the absolute creator. All that God creates is contingent on God's act as creator. So contingency forms a philosophical bridge between the theological world of thought and the scientific world of thought. Notice that creation and T equals 0 are not directly connected, like the direct relevance people say, but they're not totally irrelevant, like the irrelevant people, or the people supporting irrelevance, not the irrelevant people, say. Right? They're indirectly related through philosophy. The first book we published with the Vatican Observatory in a series that this came from was called Physics, Philosophy, and Theology, a common quest for understanding. So philosophy plays a role, like a mediator, in bringing people together in a constructive way. Okay? So it's a way of imaging that, this kind of little diagram. Okay. The second question, fine-tuning, the so-called anthropic principle. You know, it turns out that with the demise of the design argument in evolution, when Paley's arguments sort of gave out because of the rise of Darwin in the mid-19th century, it seemed as though explaining things in nature by God's design wasn't going to work. Pace, intelligent design, Pace, scientific creationism. We'll speak about those tomorrow a little bit. But it seemed as if, at least in biology, you didn't need to appeal to God to design the hand. Natural selection and variation did it just fine. All right, so there's design, but the mechanism of design are natural processes. What a shock then, 120 years later, in cosmology of all places, right, in 1974, Brandon Carter first notices that the physics of this universe has to be just so if the universe is going to be one of which life can evolve. Or to put it a little more sharply, the structures of the laws of physics, like F equals ma, or Einstein's equations, and even more precisely, the constants of nature, like the speed of light, or Planck's constant, which determines the size of quantum mechanical effects, like radioactivity, and so on. These constants of nature have to have a very specific value. And if they didn't have that value, then this universe would have been one of which life never could have arisen. Okay. It's called fine-tuning. Now, you can represent fine-tuning in terms of two constants, C1 and C2. You can represent the width of the possible values of those constants that's consistent with life. And then you can ask, how do you explain that? So let's take a look at that. Here is in the top C1 and C2, the two constants. Here's the width of C1 that allows for life. Here's the width of C2 that allows for life. So the universe has to be right inside that little square if it's going to be a universe in which life is possible. Now, just to draw the point a little more sharply, I've drawn this wide so you can see it. But it turns out that a variation of 1 part per million in the size of those constants, like the speed of light, would be a universe in which life is impossible. And there actually are 5 of these constants. So you're really looking at a 5-dimensional hypercube, and the universe has to be in it. Right? So it's fine-tuning. Right? You walk into a huge room like this, you see a dartboard on the wall, and you see a dart right in the middle. You don't just say, well, the dart had to land someplace. I mean, who cares? You say, gee, someone's a good shot. Right? I mean, it's just the way you look at it. someone's a good shot. They got the dart right there. So one kind of argument is God is the best explanation for why our universe is right there, right where it needs to be. Now, that isn't the scientific answer, of course. But if science poses a question which it cannot answer, it's fair to have people of faith give their answer. Right? It's not a scientific answer. This is not pushing God into science. It's simply saying, if science comes up with a fact which it really is baffling to behold, a fact which you really can't give a kind of straightforward answer, maybe that's the edge of science. Maybe that's the limit of science. Maybe you need a different kind of response, right? So that's a plausible move. It's not proving God. It's saying God may be a good answer or a good explanation for this fact. So God becomes the fine-tuner, and it's the so-called anthropic principle. The universe is designed for life. Now, to Christians, that makes sense because we believe God made the universe. Right? I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, the Nicene Creed. And we believe God made it for life, and in particular for self-conscious life, to come into relation with God, like us, right? To come into covenant, to have eternal life. So it's both surprising but also sort of ratifying that the universe would have this characteristic of being very special. Of course, there is another kind of explanation entirely. You could say nothing special about this universe because every possible universe exists, each of which has some other value of the natural constants. So all of these universes exist. This whole space, remember it's a 5-dimensional space, but I'm drawing 2 dimensions, is filled with actual universes. So it's a many worlds is a jargon, many worlds or multiverse explanation. Okay, so many worlds is a generic term for it. Now, that's also not a scientific explanation. It's more of a metaphysical one. What you're doing is postulating the existence, the actual existence, of an infinity of actual universes, none of which, at least in the first blush of the 1970s and 80s, were observable. These were non-observable universes. Now, it's obviously not a theological response. It's actually many people who proposed this were atheists or agnostics. They didn't want to have anything to do with the God explanation over here. But what kind of explanation is it? Is it legitimate to offer as an explanation for a scientific puzzle the idea of an actual infinity of unobservable universes? Well, is it legitimate to offer as an explanation an unobservable God? And interesting, I want to share with you, over the 30 years since this first came up, there have been fascinating debates back and forth as to which is the better explanation. Right? And you can really press that conversation. And again, tomorrow, we'll come back and look at this some more. Okay? But just to give you a taste of it, it is a fact that since Brandon Carter first recognized this fine-tuning of the constants of nature, there have been more and more sort of plausible scientific ways to explain them. So in an inflationary cosmology, the universe may have many domains. And in an eternal inflation cosmology, say of Andrei Linde, our friend at Stanford, Russian cosmologist, there are infinity of interlocking universes. So I want to say that this side has moved in impressive ways from starting off as a kind of purely metaphysical, well, a lot of universes, which was obviously a response to the sort of theistic overtones, to saying, it's actually led to some very good science. So this side has really made a lot of progress. On the other hand, the one unquestionable fact that supports this side is that whether there's one universe or an uncountable infinity of universes, it still doesn't explain why there's anything whatsoever. The multiverse explanation still presupposes the laws of nature. It still presupposes some sort of primordial matter, usually it's superspace, with quantum fields. So you can still say to Andrei Linde, which I did in a wonderful conversation once, well, where did that come about? Why is there anything at all? So this side always has a kind of robust appeal that you can't get beyond, but this side has taken on some interesting science. Now, for some of us, neither way is really the best way to go. I mean, they're interesting. It's fine to do it. But design arguments tend not to work very well. Anyone who's read Hume, The Beginning of Enlightenment, knows that design arguments beg the question of the goodness of God, the imperfection of nature, the finitude of any kind of projection of God. Richard Dawkins is always following a design argument when he accuses us Christians of a complex God who's somehow more complex than the world. It's a typical Humean argument. Really, what this is saying is something like the t=0 one. That is, the anthropic principle is not so much a design argument for God, because faith in God isn't based on the design of the universe, at least not for most of us. Faith in God is based on our experience in this church, right? In our family, and in our world, in our events of our life, in the Bible. But it is a very subtle comment, whether there are many universes or not, on the intricate interconnection between us as physical creatures of the physical cosmology and us as biological creatures of a biological evolution, and us as neurobiological creatures with a brain and self-consciousness. That is, we are more at home in the universe in which the universe is fine-tuned for life, however the fine-tuning came about. You know, when I was an undergraduate, back before the flood, you know, way back in the Dark Ages at Stanford, we didn't know this. I thought any old physics would give you life. Life really just happens to happen when it happens, and that's it. Right? And it was a very sort of purposeless view of the universe. And Jacques Monod in the 70s published his chance and design argument and argued, well, you know, we're alone in the universe. The old covenant's gone, and we just have to, you know, suck it up, have a cup of coffee, and face this fact that the universe is a brute physical fact, and life is irrelevant. Well, the fine-tuning argument is saying that's not the case. You don't have to believe in God. It might be evidence for God for you. But it certainly is evidence that we're more at home in the universe than we thought we were. We're more a participant than a spectator. We are, in a certain sense, what the universe is about. I don't mean having 10 fingers. I mean being able to be a self-conscious moral agent coming into relation with others through empathy and recognizing through faith in God as our creator. That is part of what the universe is about, because we are a psychosomatic unity in a way I didn't know about as a young physics major at Stanford. And I do know about now because of fine-tuning. So the design arguments are fine. I think there's also a great richness in discovering that this is a picture of the universe in which life is at home. And I really want to appreciate Freeman Dyson and Paul Davies. Both are wonderful colleagues, neither of whom have any particular investment in Christianity. They're open to it, but they're not Christians in a clear sense. But they definitely have used this argument against Steven Weinberg, against Richard Dawkins, and against Jacques Monod in specific in their writings to say, you're wrong. This universe is really a wonderful universe we're part of. And if you happen to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, it very much is consistent with and consonant with your belief that God created this special, extraordinary universe for life. And I will add to it, and you'll see more about this again tomorrow, that because of the actual value of Planck's constant, which is all involved with quantum mechanics, I will argue tomorrow that quantum mechanics is the place in which God can actually act in evolution without breaking the laws of nature. So quantum mechanics, operating in genetic mutations, which are part of the variation that allows life to evolve, quantum mechanics allows this universe to be open to objective divine action in a way we didn't think was possible until 1900. So we are in a radically different view of God's acting in the universe. That's, again, for more comment tomorrow, but that's a teaser for that. So fine-tuning connects our sense of being a part of the universe and of God having woven life together on the loom of nature. So let's look at evolution and creation for a few minutes. So far, I've suggested that physics and a cosmology with fine-tuning, such as we have in our universe, makes the biological evolution of life in the universe possible. Right? Doesn't force it, but it makes it a possibility. So let's look at that briefly. Here's a great picture of Charles Darwin looking very concerned about intelligent design and creations out there and what's going to happen. So Origin of Species, 1859. So key concepts, biologists here will want to add many others, but key concepts, fossil record, morphological similarities between species, widely divergent species, embryonic development of vestiges, the geography of life, phylogenetic tree of life, molecular biology, many of the pieces that have been brought together from diverse specializations to form this beautiful, beautiful synthetic view in science of many disciplines of the origin of, and diversity of species. So just a quick look at some of them. Look at this interesting structural homology or common basic plan in the limbs of vertebrates. So you've got the human being on the far right, next to us, the cat. I would have put a dog, I like dogs better. Whale and bat. Look at the similar structures in the bone structure, the morphology of the bones. Right? Here's, you know the Darwin-Finch argument. Here's a nice picture of the adaptive radiation in the Galapagos finches, where each particular species has adapted to its own microenvironment, but they also share a common ancestor. So a very good example of adaptation to the environment. Here's the phylogenetic tree of life. You know, again, back in the Dark Ages when I went to Stanford, you know, back before, when they had dinosaurs around the world, we were taught that the tree of life is like a tree. And of course, we're at the pinnacle, naturally. Well, wrong. We now know it's more like a shrub, right? And we're part of it. You got to look hard, but right next to slime molds, there are animals. That's us, okay? And the other side of us are the fungi and the plants. This is showing, you know, last common ancestor to the 3 branches, to the 2 branches, and that to these branches. So it's just showing that we are on the tree. We are here. Hello. It's not surprising we're on the graph someplace. But, you know, it isn't a particularly prominent place. If you look at this particular set of representations of last common ancestor, that's one way of looking at it. Here's another way of looking at it. This is a little more interesting. 5 million years of human evolution. Sometime you want to take a look at this chart carefully. There are pre-human primates in this kind of brownish color, right? These are pre-human primates. But then there are humans, not just Homo sapien, but here's the Hobbit in, I think it's in East Asia. Neanderthal, who died off, and so on. Chromion is one form of the human species. You know, it's really shocking if you think about it. It is as if, you know, we emerged out of this set of different populations. I mean, up to 60,000 years ago, there are probably at least 6, perhaps as many as 20 separate populations, non-interbreeding populations of proto-humans, all of which have probably most of the characteristics you and I would call the imago Dei. So, you know, primitive rational capacities, symbolic representation, artistry, verbalizations, making tools, living in community, burying their dead. I have a doctoral student who's doing I actually have 2 students doing dissertations on this very same problem. What do you mean by the imago Dei in light of the fact that there were 6 to 20 competing human prototype species of which one, us, survived? Okay, so that's a really interesting challenge to Christian faith. In any case, let's look at some of the voices out there. We'll come back again in a little more detail on this tomorrow, but just to get it out there, see what kind of voices are. So there's the voice of conflict. Maybe science and religion aren't in conflict, although for someone like Dawkins they are, because religion is, you know, a neurosis or whatever. But basically evolution and creation are definitely smack dab in conflict, and get rid of creation, it's absurd. Dawkins will tell us that evolution gives him a really strong reason to be an atheist. Well, that's fine. I mean, he's an atheist. It doesn't mean we have to be atheists. He wants us to be, but of course it doesn't mean that. Right? So my response to Dawkins is, I support the science he supports. I don't support the making of science into a metaphysics called atheism, nor do I support the idea science proves God. I start as a Christian, and I interpret the science in a theological framework. He interprets it in an atheistic framework, which is perfectly fine. He has every right to do that. But he can't say that he's forced into it and that I'm avoiding the facts, right? So yes to science, no to scientism, the making of science into a worldview. Okay, very simple. Creation science. Well, I mean, I take Genesis to be the Bible to be normative for my life. I try to follow it, but I don't take it to be literal. Right? And the whole linchpin here is not that you read the Bible as normative, but how you understand the Bible. Is it literal or is it symbolic, historical, poetic, narrative? You know, I think when the Jews came back from Babylon, from the exile, and they reclaimed their faith, they had learned the cosmology of Babylon. And what they did was they retold the story of the fall in this grand and eloquent priestly account, which becomes Genesis 1:1 to 2:4. The first chapter of Genesis is a retelling of faith in Yahweh in light of the best science of the time. I think we should do the same. So I don't think we should be stuck with that science, but I think we are blessed to inherit the faith that was expressed in that science and to re-express it in light of evolution and Big Bang cosmology. Okay. Intelligent design. Put God into Darwinism. The argument being, if science doesn't refer to God, there's no God, science is faulty, science has got to be improved, there must be an evidence for design someplace. We'll look at this in some detail tomorrow. I simply want to say that science is based on explaining natural effects by natural causes and seeing how far you can go. Right? Your car breaks, you take it to a mechanic, see if you can fix it. You don't pray over it. Well, you might pray over it, but you don't really. You take it to a mechanic. But that doesn't explain why you bought the car or where you're going to drive it or why you love its beauty or its color or you hate it. That's beyond science. So I will say to my friends in intelligent design, leave Darwin be Darwin and interpret it theologically and bring ethics to it and decide how to use it, say, in the stem cell debates. But don't try to criticize it because it doesn't refer to God. You know, my bathroom scales can't tell me what I think. They can tell me what I weigh, but they can't tell me what I think. Doesn't mean I'm not thinking. If science doesn't refer to God, doesn't mean there's no God. There's no fault there. Okay. Well, if you think there's a conflict, then maybe independence is a good move, right? Folks who've been through endless family, fights might decide to have a divorce. And someone as astonishingly scientist as Stephen Jay Gould argued that independence is the right way to view science and religion when it comes to evolution. So he had his NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria argument, which really has roots in the Enlightenment philosophy of Immanuel Kant, saying that faith and reason are just two different parts of human life, and they really have no relation. Well, again, the independence model is a really important sort of balm for the wounds of conflict. If you've been involved, in a really conflictive relation, it might be good to keep them apart. But the problem is that there are so many questions we face as individuals, as families, and as a nation, as a world, that have to do with both input from science and input from values, whether you get them from religion or from philosophy. Those have to come together. Again, when does life start? When does it end? Right? What is the basis of the dignity of life? What do we mean to do about stem cell research or about cloning? These are questions which are inherently scientific, biological, and they are inherently ethical, axiomatic, axiological. So NOMA really doesn't work because it can't address some of the very questions we have to address. So I suggest that we think in terms of a theology of nature called theistic evolution, which I think probably most of us would probably consider. And that is that evolution is how God creates life. Now, I want to be a little more careful. I'm not speaking of the origins of life. I'm speaking of the origins of the diversity of species, right? Darwin's problem. So evolution is really how God creates the diversity of species. But that's a mouthful, so I just say it's how God creates life and ask you to forgive me for being sloppy. Okay. Now let's take a look at how wide this platform is. This is what's astonishing. The conflict model, you have a very narrow platform, it's conflict. Get rid of religion or get rid of science, right? Either the atheist or the fundamentalist. Or the two worlds model, keep them separate. But when it comes to this view of dialogue, you've got voices across the spectrum. Pope John Paul II, right, was one of the leading figures in the Catholic world, in the Christian world, to promote the responsible conversation. Our center, the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, CTNS, and the Vatican Observatory, which Pope Gregory set up in the 19th century. So for 100 years they've been working in science. Our two centers have come together for 20 years in international research programs, published a variety of volumes, and it's all because, in many ways, John Paul II insisted that the Catholic Church take seriously science in a creative conversation. Right? He was furious that his native Poland had promoted the atheistic interpretation of science through Marxism, that science is inherently atheistic. So he wanted to combat that, but he knew that you can't combat a negative as well as you can advance a positive. It's one thing to say science isn't atheistic, inherently atheistic. Another thing to say science can be interpreted robustly by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So John Paul II was a profound, ardent advocate of this conversation, and in one of his most famous allocutions said that evolution is no longer merely a theory. It is a robust, successful scientific theory, and we need to interpret it. And we need to combat atheism, but we need to interpret it as Christians. Now look, at the same time, you've got Ian Barber, who was a Presbyterian clergy, obviously a physicist, and a theologian who began the Department of Religion at Carleton College. He came in to Carleton as a physicist and expanded the philosophy department to have a theology, religious studies department, I'm sorry. He has become a sort of process theologian, very far removed from most Roman Catholic thought. He is an ardent supporter of theistic evolution. Teilhard de Chardin, the famous Jesuit paleontologist, right, whose publications were refused publication, his writings were refused publication during his life. And his Phenomena Man, this beautiful, eloquent hymn to the evolution of life towards its Christification in the omega point, still has so many followers, and there's a Teilhard Society. Obviously, Chardin is supporting a kind of theistic evolution. Dennis Edwards is an Australian priest, theologian, who has written passionately on the God of evolution, as is Jack Hott, who is a lay Catholic theologian at Georgetown University. Erna McMullen, again from Notre Dame. Jürgen Moltmann, and a evangelical theologian, of course, as you know, in Germany, has written beautifully on evolution. Nancy Murphy, my first doctoral student, I'm proud to say, and Nancy teaches Christian philosophy at Fuller Seminary, has written thoroughly on evolution. Wolfhard Pannenberg, one of Europe's leading Lutheran theologians, has written an entire book on theological anthropology in light of science. Arthur Peacock, who's now dead, published over 200 papers in science, was a physical chemist, and of course an Anglican priest, and wrote his beautiful Bampton Lectures in '79, Creation, the World of Science, and continued his whole life promoting theistic evolution. Ted Peters, my colleague in seminary, Lutheran, and Marty Hewlett, who is a lay Dominican biologist, have written an expansive series of books looking at the varieties of approaches to evolution, including creation science and intelligent design, and then theistic evolution as a spectrum, and locating myself and others in that spectrum. And then Karl Rahner, perhaps the most distinguished, arguably one of the most distinguished Catholic theologians of the 20th century. You may or may not know that he was instrumental in behind the scenes in the documents of Vatican II. And you'll see, if you read carefully, you'll see the flavor of Teilhard in many of those documents. He also wrote extensively on evolution in the Christological framework. So Karl Rahner, Catholic theologian, embracing evolution and interpreting it in light of his continental philosophy, his Neo-Kantianism, and his Roman Catholic commitments. Okay, point number 4, suffering in evolution. Do you recognize this little creature here? It's looking at you. This is the wasp that lays its larvae in caterpillars for food. Right? In fact, it even stings the caterpillar so it can't die and remains alive. Nasty. The evolution of life during 3.5 billion years, filled with beauty. It is a beautiful creature, torn with pain. So, 2 accounts. The biblical account, all that is created good by God. God doesn't create evil. All that is, being in existence, is good. The fall, suffering and death arise for humankind and are a consequence of the fall. Right? Suffering and death are a consequence of an historical act, which is an act of a free moral agent, not God. And that fall narrative then accounts for suffering and death in nature. And then to back it up, Augustine had a second narrative about the cosmic fall of the angels, which Milton forever enshrined in Paradise Lost, and Dante enshrined in the Divine Comedy, right, with Lucifer at the bottom of the pit, the worst fallen angel. That's one account of the fact that there's suffering, disease, death, and extinction. There are hurricanes, tornadoes, right, tidal waves, tsunamis. There are extinction by meteoroid impact, asteroid impact. There is death by cancer. A second account is the evolutionary account. Natural evil, pain, suffering, disease, death, extinction, you name it, are constitutive of life. They're not a consequence of an event. They are part of what makes life happen. Right? They are part of the biological process that vastly preceded the human species. Now, unless you really want to bend your mind out of shape, it's pretty hard to figure out how, when we came on board, right, about, a couple 100,000 years ago, maybe 1 million years ago, you saw that diagram before, of Homo sapien coming on board, after 3.5 billion years of life. It's pretty hard to see how we did it, right? I mean, it's absurd. So that's not a small problem. Now, remember, this is not a conflict between theology and science. This is not Dawkins speaking. This is me speaking. I'm a Christian. I'm a scientist. I'm saying I've got a problem. This is a real problem. Right? And in a good relationship, you have problems, right? You have arguments. You have issues. I mean, that's what life's about. It's about finding out how to solve them in a way which honors the other and values peace, but tries to get there by going through the steps. You've got to work your way through. Let me just say that this challenge 4, and the one I'm going to conclude with in about 5 minutes, challenge 5, are the hardest challenges in the field of theology and science, from my point of view. There are no easy answers now. We're getting into the deeper water, right? But I want you to at least see it, because I want you to know this is an invigorating field, it's a challenging field. My doctoral students, my seminary students work hard at understanding how Christian faith deals with these issues. So, it is a shift from natural evil, disease, suffering, death, extinction, and so on, being a consequence to being constitutive. Fundamental shift in our way of thinking about life. But it doesn't mean we abandon the idea that God is the creator of life, obviously. That's normative to our faith. So if God creates through the process of nature, what is God's relation or response to suffering in nature? We'll do more with this tomorrow. But let me just give you 2 wonderful quotes to set the stage. For followers of Darwin, the familiar theological problem of evil, right, was turned inside out. Evil could henceforth be assumed. And the existential paradox, which demanded explanation, became the problem of goodness. David Oates is a good guy. I mean, he's on our side. But he's trying to put into words how serious this problem is. This isn't just a little, we'll catch up after lunch kind of thing. This is like a monumental thing. And of course, Richard Dawkins. In this sense, Dawkins is right. It's just a question of how you respond to Dawkins. Look what he says. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but pointless indifference. That's a profound statement. Okay? Well, let me just outline for you the kind of responses people give to this. Christians, Jews, and Muslims respond to the problem of suffering with God who saves, God who redeems. So the basic move that most people in theology and science have made is that God suffers with all creatures. God experiences suffering. And that presence of God with suffering, right, whether it's at a deathbed or it's within an extinction of species, like Neanderthal, is a redemptive experience. This is the great insight of Jürgen Moltmann in the mid-20th century, who talked about the crucified God. You start with redemption, and you expand that into creation. Now, in a redemption theology, you really have sort of three versions. There are many details and many others, but three basic versions. One is that God transforms the world through objective and subjective immortality. Ian Barber, process theology, would say that God's experience of suffering is sufficient. I'm remembered by God, and that memory of me is something I experience myself. It's called subjective immortality. A second version would be something like Arthur Peacock's appeal to Dante's Visio Dei, the vision of God. That what really counts is that we have an eternal, unending experience of God after death. We are in the presence of God. We are literally in the presence of God. And his leitmotif for this is Dante's Paradiso, and the ending of the paradise, where the souls are in the presence of God forever. Now, John Polkinghorne and I take a different approach. We focus on the bodily resurrection of Christ. This, as you can imagine, puts us at some distance from the Jesus Seminar and from Bultmann and all those who would talk about the resurrection as simply being the experience of the disciples. I think the tomb was empty. I think Jesus' body was transformed. I think he is risen from the dead. Now, the point is that those have different interactions with science. The first three are fine. There's no challenge from science. You can believe with Ian Barber that God remembers you. Science isn't going to challenge that. You can believe with Arthur Peacock that God is the centerpiece of the endless joy of the saints in the paradise. But if you believe that the future of the universe is to be the new creation that the Revelation of John promises, science is a huge challenge. So how do John and I respond to the challenge of science? So that's the fifth and last topic for now. Frontier challenge, eschatology and cosmology. The far future of the universe, according to science, is freeze or fry. Expand forever or recollapse. And in either case, the extinction of all life in the universe will happen in the near future, when stars go into black holes and the galaxy shreds into fundamental particles. So most scholars in theological science sort of acknowledge the challenge by ignoring it, right? Sort of passing nod. And that's unfortunate, but it is, I think, the key area of research. I'm just going to say a little bit about it. Again, the challenge is the same diagram we saw at the beginning: freeze, freeze, or fry for the far future. The universe expands forever and cools to zero exponentially, or it recollapses and heats to endless temperature. Neither one is consistent or compatible with Christian eschatology. Eschatology, from the point of view that I take it, and many New Testament scholars take it, is based on the resurrection of Jesus, not a resuscitation. It wasn't like Lazarus, who came back and died. And it's not an immortal soul, the early Gnostics or the Protestant theologians or the Bultmannians, Jesus Seminar. It is an empty tomb. Faith isn't based on the empty tomb. The empty tomb characterizes the meaning of bodily resurrection. And it requires the general resurrection at the end of the age. This is perhaps the most challenging part of the challenge. Here's the quote from Paul that particularly embodies this challenge, and I put the really relevant parts in blue. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. Okay. If Christ did not rise up, then the dead do not rise. The argument in Corinthians is not Jesus rose, therefore there'll be a general resurrection. Quite the opposite. Paul, as a Pharisee, believed in the resurrection, the general resurrection. And it was that belief in the general resurrection which allowed him to say, aha, it's begun with Jesus. So if there is no general resurrection, then Jesus didn't rise. This is Paul's logic. It's very clear. So now we have a challenge. And I want to simply put the challenge in both directions. It's a challenge from cosmology to eschatology. If the predictions of scientific cosmology come to pass, there'll never be a general resurrection, and therefore Christ didn't rise, and our hope is in vain. But it also comes from eschatology to cosmology. If it is true that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, then the general resurrection cannot be impossible. This must in turn mean that the future of the universe will not be what science predicts. Now that's a conflict model. Okay. And it might be the only one we have. But actually there is an interesting subtlety here. The challenge is not actually from science, but from a philosophical assumption which we routinely bring to science without really thinking about it. And that is that the future will be what science predicts. Now, technically, it's that if you have a theory which is robust because it explains all your previous data, then you expect it to apply to future data, and you falsify it against that data. That's different than saying that prediction has to happen. It's a philosophical argument, and let's unpack it for a second. It really goes back to Hume and the Enlightenment. You see it in Rudolf Bultmann, you see it explicitly in John Dominic Crossan, the argument that we have to take scientific predictions as literally holding. Now, usually the argument is based on the claim that the laws of nature govern nature. The laws of physics are prescriptive. Nature must obey them. But it really is a kind of dodge the physicists give us. After all, when the electrons move about, they aren't solving the Dirac equation for electrons and letting it tell them where to go. Electrons have natural efficacy to do what they do. Matter has its own internal efficacy to be what it is. And our laws of nature describe that. Our laws are descriptive, not prescriptive. The natural efficacy, the power of nature to be causal, is in nature. It's not in some laws that set up that nature has to obey. So if nature does something different, it isn't breaking the laws. It's simply acting in a way which the laws can't capture. Well, why would nature act differently? Well, for Christians, ultimately, nature does what it does because of God. God is the creator and redeemer of the world. God is the power through which nature does what nature does. So if God were to choose to do something new, radically new, God isn't breaking the law of nature, right? They describe what God's done in the past. So if we assume the regulators of nature, which science describes, are ultimately due to the regular and faithful action of God as an ongoing creator, then if God chooses to act in a new way, the future will not be what science predicts. Not because science didn't make the right calculation, but because it's based on the old way of doing things. So look, if I have a chicken sandwich for lunch every day for 10 years, you'd probably predict tomorrow I'm going to have a chicken sandwich. If I had a roast beef sandwich, I didn't break some law of nature. I simply acted in a new way. Our Christian life is all about acting in a new way, right? Through forgiveness. Well, if God chose to act in a new way, there's no conflict with science. It's simply something that goes beyond science's current power to predict. So in fact, the challenge between science, between cosmology and eschatology really isn't between them. It's between cosmology and eschatology with this assumption that what science predicts has to happen, being the middle, the bargaining person, right? And that's setting up the challenge. And that's the one we can challenge. It's the Enlightenment assumption that so influenced theology that the whole tradition from Rudolf Bultmann through to the present continues to be enslaved to it. But in fact, we can be free to it if we truly believe God acted in a new way at Easter. So how do we continue that conversation? It's very hard. It's very exciting. A number of us are working on this conversation. This really is a frontier domain in theology and science. I think you can see it's a kind of straight line from saying God's the creator of the universe. The beginning reflects that astonishing fact of it being God's creation. Doesn't prove it. The fine-tuning reflects us being at home as God's creatures in the universe. Evolution is the way God creates life. It isn't atheistic. It's open to theism. It raises the question of suffering. God's response is compassion, redemption. Redemption is about Christ's incarnation, ministry, death and resurrection. Death and resurrection imply the resurrection of the dead, the new creation. The challenge from science isn't from science. It's from a philosophy of science that says science has the final say. Science doesn't have the final say. The final say is God. And if we can continue that conversation, I think we have an exciting series of new issues to pursue as we continue this creative interaction with theology, between theology and science. So thank you. I'm going to stop now and be open for comments and conversation for as long as you wish to stay. Thank you. It was already.
Okay, we have roughly close to half an hour for questions. So let's take some questions. No questions? If you don't ask questions, I'll go about a half hour
Right
discussing with this guy myself.
There's a lot of work being done now on the fact that there is no separate body, that the mind-body interaction now, mind-body-spirit, is really much more complex than the dualism of Descartes. So do you have any comment on that in relationship to this new thinking, which seems to be coming into?
Thank you. The wonderful topic raised about the intimate connections between mind and brain in the cognitive sciences, neurosciences, and how that could be a challenge or could be an ally to Christian thought about what makes us us, Christian anthropology. Thank you. A lot of us inherit a tradition that goes back to Augustine that we are body plus soul, right? And the body is mortal, it dies. The soul is immortal, but it longs for the body. There'll be resurrection, they'll be reunited. That's fine. And if that's the anthropology you have inherited or you want to affirm, fine. It certainly is embedded in our Christian culture deeply. But there is a second anthropology which goes back to Paul, and that is that we are a psychosomatic unity. Paul's term for the human person was somo psychikon. We are a psychosomatic unity. When we die, the whole person dies. But the whole person is raised as a spiritual body, somo pneumatikos, a spiritual body. And the key term there is body. It doesn't mean in a gross sense flesh, but it does mean something in continuity with this flesh. That's why the empty tomb is so critical. So I tend to come out of the Pauline tradition. I'm not trying to say one is right or wrong. They are both very present. Roman Catholics tend more to think in terms of body and soul. A lot of conservative Protestants do. But I simply want to say that Paul's view of the person is psychosomatic unity, and that our modern term psychosomatic is really pretty close translation to his Greek notion of, his Greek term for the person. Now, what's interesting about that is that a lot of folks like Nancy Murphy and others, Phil Clayton, who's been here and spoken, have done a lot of work on showing that the functions of the human person, which we used to attribute to the soul, are really functions of the brain. So emotional capacities, capacity for empathy, rational capacities, capacity to do mathematics, right? Capacity for relationship, and so on. Many of these functions of the person, which Aquinas would have attributed to the soul as a separate, for Aquinas it's a little more subtle, because for Aquinas the soul was the form of the body, because Aquinas followed Aristotle. But in any case, it was a separate part of the human person. A lot of those really are, in fact, the function of the brain. So on the one hand, as you point out, contemporary science and philosophy of mind suggest that we are a psychosomatic unity, and that does have theological Christian biblical roots. On the other hand, it's one step from the precipice of reductionism, saying the mind is nothing but the brain. So the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia Churchland, won't talk about psychosomatic unity. They'll talk about the brain. And they'll draw a very simple analogy. Thinking is to the brain like digestion is to the stomach. Right? The stomach simply does that. It isn't like digestion is something. It's just a process of the stomach. And that's all the brain is. You and I aren't aware of our neurons firing. We're aware of being a self. We're tired, it's 9 o'clock, we're processing ideas, right? But in fact, that's an illusion. It's for Patricia Churchland, it's called focus psychology. So my colleagues like Nancy and Phil and myself, others, are also working on not falling into that reductive, what's called eliminative materialism, where you not just relate mental states and brain states, that's fine, but you reduce mental states entirely to brain states. So it's eliminative. You eliminate the need for any reference to mind. Now, how do people function that way? I don't know how they do, because they have to talk. So I don't know how they do to be consistent. But I simply want to say that for those Christian theologians like Nancy and Phil and many others who choose to talk about psychosomatic unity and rejoice in the discoveries of the neurosciences and cognitive sciences in helping us understand the functioning of a person, they are also obliged to give very powerful arguments against going too far and falling into reductive, eliminative materialism. Now, the key to that, and I'll simply stop with this question, the key is to argue that there is genuine causal efficacy of the mind. That is, the mind actually does something. Because if you can show that mental states act themselves out in body states, like I wave my arm, right? Then you've got really pretty powerful grounds that there's something about the mind. It's not a substance, but it's something more than just a function like digestion. And it's that middle ground, again, for Aristotle, between function, meaning eliminate, and thing, meaning dualism. It's that middle ground of complex emergent monism that all of us are committed to. And the way, again, is to try to show evidence for top-down mind-brain causality. And one of the best books around, Nancy wrote, I think 2 years ago, I think it's called Bodies and Souls, or Embodied in Soul Body. I think that's what it's called. I can get the reference. But it's an excellent book on this problem. So I want to, that's one of the hardest problems around it. You had the book? Yeah. Okay, what do you think? Do you like it? Yeah. Okay.
But I thought it was a little too materialistic.
Yes, I understand, because Nancy's a physicalist. Because she wants to go toe-to-toe with the scientists and still argue against causal. Yeah, right. It's a hard, challenging book. Okay, other questions?
Let's go on.
What do you think happens after death?
I think you're with the Lord, instantly. But I'm open to Catholics saying there's purgatory. I don't want to get into a debate over it, but I do believe you are. But I believe you are as a resurrected person, not as a spirit. Because I think this universe counts. I really do. Thank you.
I have a question regarding your freeze or fry statement. We're sitting here in the 21st century with what we believe is pretty settled science, and and I profoundly respect it and see just how far it's come. But we're also dealing with our understanding of the universe within the framework of what we know now. It's very different from what human beings knew 1,000 years ago. Do you have any kind of a hint of what science will be like in 1,000 years from now, and whether the understandings then will be profoundly different than they are now, and whether some of the things that were really, really problems for us might be just duck soup, to use a vernacular expression, to them then?
I have no clue, but I will honor your point by saying it's a very important point. That is, we need to take science very seriously, but not literally or as if it were final. Right? When I engage with science, let's say cosmology, I engage with the best cosmology of the time, but I know it's going to change radically. If I use the fact it's going to change to avoid the confrontation, I wouldn't do my work. If I simply rested with the present results, I wouldn't continue the conversation. So when I first began writing in cosmology, Big Bang and T equals 0 were very prominent, and I wrote a lot about that. Then inflation, and then eternal inflation and multiverse came on, and I've written a lot about that. So somehow you have to keep with the conversation. Wait, back here? Back here? Oh, sorry.
I see the book of Genesis as a story written by a genius who perhaps did understand some aspects of human evolution. For example, when Adam and Eve were given the choice to eat the apple, they were told, either threatened or promised, that they would become as God, knowing good and evil. Could not this suggest the dawn of human awareness, or and when they observed that they were naked, self-awareness, and therefore a differentiation between humankind and the lower animals, and couldn't, if they are lower, but couldn't the writer of Genesis have had some inkling of that and tried to convey that?
Yeah. That's a wonderful point. I hope we all heard her. I think that it's a wonderful agenda to be in conversation with Old Testament scholars who have studied the material carefully to say, well, what insights could the priestly authors have had that were really sort of permanent insights? And which ones were so cultural bound that we can honor them and respect them, but not be tied to them today? And that's an ongoing conversation within biblical scholarship, and I value your saying that. I think it's very important to say that. One of the challenges I meant to suggest from science is that the science is a little more complex in saying that there were many competing species, all of whom had the same sort of human characteristics, and only one of them won out. So it's a little bit harder to try to put a creation-fall account in that framework. But certainly saying, yeah, the Babylonian cosmology had some profound points to it, and we can learn from that. Yeah, I think we can.
When I was listening to you, I was thinking recently I've read something about the concept of biocentrism. You know, the idea that existence requires an observer. Could you speak to that at all?
Biocentrism, or the idea that
that existence,
yes,
whatever is, requires an observer.
Okay, give the microphone back to him. Yeah. Okay, there are two questions in that. Biocentrism, I take it to mean we should move away from a radical and unique focus on humankind and anthropocentrism to the wider bio community. And that's, of course, absolutely radically important. It's still us making that move. You can't take the humanity out of the biocentrism, but I think you're right. I tend to think in terms of theocentrism, to think of God as the creator of all life. So biocentrism would be a kind of secular environmental movement, which I would embrace within a wider theistic one. Second question was, do you need an observer for there to be existence? There are deep philosophical traditions in Eastern religions, in Hinduism, which would support that. There are interesting philosophical traditions in the West in terms of idealism. You might see in someone like Hegel or Berkeley who would support that. But interestingly, there's a tradition in terms of quantum mechanics which might support that. And quantum mechanics, as you know, is one of the two pillars of contemporary physics, relativity and quantum mechanics. So let's say it's unquestioned, it's a theory, basically. There are half a dozen to a dozen radically different and viable interpretations of quantum mechanics. Some are fairly straightforward, but some are pretty mind-blowing. And one of the ones coming out of von Neumann and others like that, Dave Bohm in some ways looked at this, John Wheeler in some ways does, and many others, is that things don't actually become actuality. The move from potential to actual existence happens when something is observed. That is, it's actually the mental process of observation which makes a state become actual evidence. And so it's a strong argument for the role of mind in nature. Now, there's a subtle point in that, and I'll just leave it at this, is the argument that something moves from potential to actual existence, or is the argument that something moves from non-existence to existence? Right. And it's a much harder case to make that observation creates out of nothing. It's a more, I think, more plausible interpretation that observation gives you actual states. So when you look in the box, you see what's there. It wasn't really that way until you looked. But it doesn't say the box and the thing in it didn't exist until you looked. So existence, depending upon mind, is a radical form of the way things exist, depending upon mind.
You had a slide which depicted two ways of looking at evil. One way is a result of the fall, another way, a scientific way, being the result of evolution. I'm wondering, I've been thinking about the possibility of a third way. The third way might be that there's a branch of physics that's statistical physics. And I'm wondering if one could look at evil as the result of statistical physics. In other words, there's an order to things, but when things due to statistical fluctuations go awry, bad things happen. I can walk out the door and there's a statistical chance that I'll get run over by a drunk driver. There's a statistical chance that a meteorite will come through the roof and impact us all, and so on. And these are what we consider to be evil. So could one also look at evil in terms of just statistical physics?
Thank you. That's an excellent suggestion. I've written a lot on what I call entropy and evil, and it's exactly on the point you're making. That most of the processes we call evil, like cancer, right, are in some ways the increase of disorder of a system. And that's exactly what you're referring to in statistical thermodynamics. But there's a deeper question I was trying to get to, and that is in the Genesis account, taking it for what it's saying, just what does the story say? You've got a kind of perfect way of living. There is no evil in the Garden of Eden account. Now, there's a Pache there. There's no evil in it. And then the choice of the first couple results in a disordering of the world. And the possibility of those kinds of examples you gave, meteorites hitting the earth, cancer occurring, being hit by a drunk driver, all those things are after the fall. They aren't the cause of the fall. I understand. It's, right, exactly. Natural evil and moral evil. And the point is, how do we account for natural evil? The fall accounts for it by moral evil. Moral evil causes natural evil. Evolution says natural evil was there already and predates moral evil. So it's a totally different question. Okay, and that's what's hard to get at. How do we talk about Christian theology in light of natural evil predating moral evil? Not that there's natural evil. Okay. And I just want to emphasize that I don't mean to make Augustine too important, but his influence is absolutely monumental. He's probably the most important theologian that Catholics and Protestants share. And Augustine is the source. Augustine was the first patristic theologian who ordered the accounts in terms of a history. Let me give you a quick example. Origen's theory is that the souls fell, God creates the earth to stop the fall, God then saves them through Christ, and the earth is dissolved. It's a different ordering of the accounts. First is the fall, then there's creation, then there's salvation, then the creation is gone. Augustine was the first one to say, first is creation, then there's the fall, then there's redemption, then creation is transformed to new creation. And he said it in a way in which we could read it like history. So it became history. There was a historical fall, but that's a theological account. Now we have an evolutionary account, which is a different kind of sequence. First, there's creation. And with creation, there is natural evil, suffering, disease, death, and extinction. Then there's humankind and moral evil. And none of us have done a very good job of re-knitting together those theologies against this loom of history, because we're all so saturated with the way of looking at the world that we get through the tradition.
Is there a lady who would have a question?
I'm interested in your perspective or understanding of medical cures as they are reported.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just leave it at that.
Sure. Well, I think with God, anything is possible. I think with God, anything is possible. So I'm open to miraculous cures. I think we need to do a lot of work on what a miracle is, because we tend to work out of what's, again, an Enlightenment view of miracle, which is Hume's definition. It's a breaking of a law of nature. And if we go back to earlier understandings in the Christian tradition, miracle is an extraordinary act of grace against the ordinary fullness of grace in our life. People like Augustine wouldn't have thought of a law of nature being broken. They wouldn't have thought of God doing a special deed. So it didn't set up the miracle as being anti-rational or against something. It set up more as an extraordinary gift of grace, like Christmas Day, right, compared to the gifts you might get on an ordinary day, right? So if we use that understanding of miracle, not breaking nature, but the overwhelming fecundity of nature, then I think we're quite able to take on board accounts of the miraculous and not see these as somehow putting us in conflict with science. At the same time, science does seem to suggest a regularity and an order to nature which these things don't seem to fit into very well, right? So the people like myself who work in theology and science try to give accounts of nature which is much more open to indeterminism and uncertainty because of science than in spite of science. So most of us, like John and Nancy and I, try to say science, at least some of the sciences, portray nature as less lockstep, mechanistic than Newton's science did. So in fact, science itself becomes a partner. So rather than Hume say it's against science, or Augustine saying, I don't even know about science, I'm saying contemporary science can, doesn't have to, but can portray nature as more vulnerable and fluid and open to your and my action as creatures, free will, and God's action. Okay. Thank you.
You seem to have a great deal of respect for what's established by science, and I noticed that you don't subscribe to creationism. You do accept that there's some 5 million years of human evolution and many human species and so on. So, and that, to my way of thinking, is very laudable. But what I don't understand is your suggestion, maybe wish, that, that freezing and frying is maybe not going to happen, and that all of nature's laws will be overturned. And that seems to me to be putting religion above the science, when the religion or the theology is not, again, to my way of thinking, as certain, not certain, as trustable as scientific knowledge is. Would you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in case you didn't hear, the questioner is saying that I've given a lot of credibility to science and taken it very seriously. And yet when it comes to eschatology, I'm sort of saying, well, science is wrong. The universe is not going to be freeze or fry. Yeah, I think that is the direction I'm going. But I want to say a little more about that because it's a really hard problem. What I'm trying to do is distinguish between taking the theories we have, like neo-Darwin evolution or quantum mechanics, which are well tested against past results, and saying, therefore, I'll accept them as the best account we have. Pace, we could have a new one, but the best account we have so far of what we know has happened. Right? We know how radioactive works. We know it's happened, and on that basis, you can make a prediction. It doesn't mean the prediction has to hold, because it means that would assume that that law of science will also hold. So there's simply one more step in that argument. You and I don't usually make it, but it's there in the logic. So it's not a challenge to science. It's simply saying, well, if the laws of quantum mechanics continue to hold tomorrow, then the half-life of uranium will be whatever. I forget. Sorry. Okay. But it's that small little if, all else being equal, that's built into the logic of the laws of nature that I'm trying to pick at. Because I think it's, to me at least, for myself as a Christian, it's very important to be focused on what I consider to be the central witness of Christianity, which is Christ rose from the dead. And not to water that away, as a lot of folks have done this century, into some other account, like the disciples gained, courage and went off and became martyrs. Well, yeah, they did, but why? What happened? So there's so much writing on that. I want to pay particular attention to that little what-if clause in the middle of that scientific argument. Now, is it rational to say the laws of nature as we know them now need not hold tomorrow? Well, it depends on what you think of the laws of nature. Hume was very clear they had to. Hume believed the laws of nature, like Newton's laws, are prescriptive, they're all known, and they're all constant. Right? No new laws are going to be discovered. The ones we have will hold, always held, always will hold. So it's nomological universality. And they hold in the sense that the laws of the state hold. You have to stop at a red sign. It's a prescription. Now, each of those are philosophical assumptions. I'm not saying they're bad ones, they're very good ones, but they aren't necessary ones, they're assumptions. So if you have enough reason to believe you want to challenge those assumptions, you're not challenging science. You're challenging the assumptions which imply that scientific predictions must happen. They are apodictic. And that's what I'm challenging, because I think so much is at stake for Christians in the resurrection of Christ. Now, I can be wrong. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. I'm just trying to explain why I'm able to take science so seriously, and yet recognize that in doing that, I don't want to take a philosophical assumption about science that comes out of the Enlightenment as if it were identical to science. Yeah. Of course, please. Please.
To me, it is a challenge to science because you're both with regard to miracles and with regard to the freeze and fry. You're saying not just that a specific prediction could change, which of course it can, and that's happened many, many times in science, but that natural laws are going to change. And with regard to Newton's laws, they hold for over a certain domain.
Right.
Relativity has held forever.
Right.
Where is the evidence that natural laws have ever changed?
Well, again, I think you're absolutely right, but there's a caveat in there. And maybe we could talk about this afterwards because it's getting late, but all I want to say is, from my point of view, there's a caveat. There's a philosophical argument sitting within the domain that we call science. And it's not a scientific theory. It's not ethical domain. It's not Einstein's equations. It's the assumption scientific laws can't change. And that they prescribe what happens. Okay. And that simply is not a part of science. It's a part of an assumption we make about science, say in falsificationism. Right? I'm not saying it isn't a good assumption. I just want to be certain that you see I'm not arguing with Einstein's field equations. It's not like his predictions as solving the equations are wrong. It's that they needn't hold if the laws of nature themselves are not apodictic. But the whole idea of science is that it's a posteriori. Mathematics is a priori, but physics is synthetic. Physics is about applying these necessary mathematical equations to contingent physical states. Now, if God is ultimately at work in nature, and if God chooses to work in a new way, those laws won't hold. So it's not a challenge to science per se. It's a challenge to the philosophical assumption which we routinely bring to science, but isn't part of science. At least that's we have.
Let me make a comment. Polkinghorne has a very interesting book. I think it's The Hope of God and the End of the Universe, where he really gets into that. And I think he takes a little bit different position than you in that. So that this is really big, wide open question where you want to go with it. I'm going to give this gentleman the last question of the evening.
How do you interpret the assumption story?
The assumption, sorry?
The assumption of Jesus.
Thank you. Well, it's like the resurrection accounts in general. They are a profound mixture of narrative, myth, factuality, and I rely upon New Testament scholars, because I'm not one, to work their way through that complex and try to see what might have had historical reliability, what was a way of talking about it. The assumption is probably the hardest one, because he didn't go up there someplace, because there is no up there to go. If I had to give an answer like that, I would say he went into the future, because the future is the new creation. But not like he went faster in time than you and I do. It's not like his clock went faster. It's the way Pannenberg will talk about it, and Pannenberg's a really, really helpful theologian in this, and then John and I are kind of derivative of Pannenberg, is that the resurrection accounts are the word is prolepsis, it means a historical instance of a future event in time. So it's the end times reality, the new creation reality, breaking into the present reality. So it's not so much he went someplace as the future that we will all experience comes into our present. Now you can imagine that in ways, a wormhole or something. I mean, whether or not that's helpful, I don't know. But it isn't a moving, it's not a local motion, it's not a motion in space. That was the description of it. It's a presence for a period of time, which ceases, 40 days, of what is to be the future of the universe in the present at the first Easter. Now, you may not believe that, I may not believe it, it may not be a good way of describing it, but it gets at this truly mysterious event, which I think shapes our lives. What happens the moment you die? I think that same sort of process where the future, heaven if you like, or for N.T. Wright, the new creation, embraces the present and takes you into it. So you have continuity, you're in the presence of Christ. We see a body, and they're both true.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to close it for right now.